Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's session, Managing and Improving Your Energy Use, which is part of the Low Carbon Lincolnshire program. So this is me. My name is David Knight. I'm a principal consultant at PECT, and we're working on behalf of Business Lincolnshire to deliver these workshops. Essentially, I've been involved in carbon accounting for several years now and work with a wide range of organisations, mostly focused on environmental management, but my specialism is the carbon element of that process. At PECT, our aim is to protect and enhance the environment to leave a legacy for future generations. And we're always working towards helping organizations to develop good understanding of the current trends and challenges in the field of sustainability and low carbon, as well as practical ways to implement them. Just in terms of today's webinar, so we are delivering a series of fully funded bespoke workshops and supporting materials. These initial sessions, such as today, are introductory webinars, and these will give high level sort of going over the requirements, but we won't go into much of the details. So the idea of today's session is just to sort of touch on the high level aspects, but really the work that we're looking to do are in the workshops. So within the workshops, they'll be able to work with you as organizations on a more sort of individual level and to delve deeper into the topics that we've been covering throughout these sessions. These sessions are recorded, so you are able to go back to have a look at them if there's anything in there you want to go over. And like I said, if there is something you want to delve into further, please book along to our workshops. We'll be able to go into more detail. We've broken down the net zero topic into four main ones. So net zero, obviously, which is the overarching need for all of this. And what we're going to introduce today is the energy management element of it. So decarbonisation is the exploration of the carbon elements of net zero, and then energy management supports your decarbonisation journey in terms of how you need to understand your energy needs, how to apply that understanding to your organisation in terms of identifying opportunities, and how to use the data and information to be able to inform your decisions. The last introductory webinar we'll be doing is around supply chains, which is arguably probably the most complex part of the net zero process. And that's where we'll explore the value chain requirements. And it's really aimed at organizations who are at the point of starting to address their wider emissions. So throughout today's session, if you do have any questions, please add them into the Q&A section. We will have a bit of time at the end to go over any questions that have been asked. And really what we're just going to do today is to sort of crack on with the topic in hand. And yes, we have a Q&A session at the end. Please add any questions into there if there's anything that comes up, and we'll talk about it at the end. Cool. Okay. So going to take me off the screen and let's get started. So the reason we're all here today is to talk about net zero. I'm not going to cover this. We covered this in the very first webinar that we did, but this is basically the precursor. So net zero is the agenda around carbon management, with the key idea of this is to understand your value chain emissions. So here we're not talking about just ourselves as an organization, but actually the entire impact we have as an organization, including who we work with and the products that we purchase. The aim of net zero is to reduce our impact across the value chain. And to do this, we need to reduce our emissions and then balance any remaining emissions through carbon removals. If you'd like to know a bit more about net zero and what it means, please look at the first webinar that we did a few weeks back now. In terms of additional information, so the UK Business Climate Hub has a whole range of different topics and guidance for organizations that they can use, including links to online calculators, guides, toolkits, etc. So what we'll talk about here today is to sort of hopefully give you the information you need that when you do go to these external sources, they'll start to make a bit more sense in terms of how it applies to you as an organization. And really what we're talking today is energy management. So whenever we talk about our carbon emissions, we talk about it in scopes. Again, we talked about this in the first and second webinar. But really today we're talking about energy management, and that means we're primarily focusing on scope 1 and 2. So for any organization who's actually looking at their own carbon emissions and how they can make reductions within that, that's really where energy management comes into its own. So first of all, we want to understand the need for energy management. And like I say, it's strongly recommended that all organizations develop and introduce some form of energy management. I mean, the sort of the basis going that you can't manage what you don't measure. So it's absolutely fundamental for organizations to start to look at the type of energy they're using, how they're using the energy, and start to put forward a management process that will allow them to then understand where there's opportunities to make reductions. Throughout the process, there are schemes, accreditations, and third-party engagement pieces that will help to support organizations in energy management. And while it's not necessarily required, is generally recommended. And the reason for that is because by actually involving a third party, they can look at and validate the efforts and work that you're doing and help to recognize where there might be opportunities as well. So whilst energy management is something you can do yourself, and we'll touch a bit on that today, and certainly within the workshop, if there is a sort of third-party accreditation scheme that looks at energy management, we would recommend that you do sort of look at that to get that sort of third-party intervention. For anybody who's starting out energy management, and this link here is probably aimed at larger organizations, those who have more complex energy needs, the Carbon Trust has produced a self-assessment tool. It's referred to as a maturity matrix. You basically go through and score yourself in terms of where you think you sit within the energy process. And it will start to give you an idea of actually how well you're managing yourself, how well you're managing your energy, and where there might be opportunities to improve the management aspect of your business. Within the Carbon Trust as well, there are free guides and toolkits that allow a high-level overview of how you currently manage your energy. And the assessment toolkit actually looks at policy all the way through to training and on-site improvements. And as I say, the Carbon Trust has got further documents you can download to support in where there's opportunities. And what's really important whenever we start an energy management process, that you think about the resources involved. So we need to think about personnel, who ultimately is going to be responsible for delivering this. What kind of roles do you need within the organization? What kind of training needs do you have? And what kind of investments are you likely to put into it? So whilst obviously the need to manage, where you do identify opportunities, there's likely going to be some form of investment, whether that's in time, training, or actually financial investment to make the necessary changes as well. So throughout the entire process, we talked about carbon management, and really when we're looking at carbon management, accurate monitoring and recording of resource use is critical. In order to make decisions, we need to have as much as good access to accurate data as you possibly can. Also, when we're setting targets and delivering action plans, that use of that data and that accurate recording allows us to ensure that any changes we're making are having the effect that they need to. And as part of energy management, you also want to think about how you're assessing yourself. So auditing yourself helps to continually improve performance and identify additional opportunities. And throughout any sort of management program, good communication keeps employees engaged. So once you identify where there's training needs or behavioral changes, actually communicating that out to your staff ensures that engagement, but also ensures that you're making the changes and achieving the reductions that you set out to achieve. So in terms of energy, what I just wanted to quickly cover for everybody is just to talk about how energy is sort of generated. So this is our current energy system. We go from generation through a transmission grid through to you as a consumer. So it's very simplified, but essentially that's how energy is generated. Now, in terms of the UK, the mix that we receive, so as we can see here from 2009 until present, we can see how the actual energy generation has changed over time. So look at the sort of big black one that was coal, and as coal's reduced, we've seen a larger increase in renewable. What's really good to see at the moment, and there are online displays you can go to, and we see that actually generation at the moment, almost 50% of our generation now comes from renewables. So we can see that actually as part of the UK grid, energy is slowly moving towards a more renewable source. We talked previously regarding sort of REGOs and the purchasing of green tariff, and here we can see how the grid is made up, and we all essentially consume relatively the same sort of energy. And so it's why it's important that we make sure that when we're reporting our carbon emissions, we are looking at what we consume through the grid and not just looking at green tariffs as an option. Now, one of the key things in terms of energy management, one of the reasons why actually reducing energy is vital, not just decarbonizing, is because when we look at how energy is generated, as we can see within this slide here, just to sort of point it out, the purple bit at the top and the green bit at the bottom, that's all fossil fuel. So in terms of the electricity that we consume, we're actually, shall we say, in terms of the energy we consume, we can see how a vast majority of that comes from fossil fuels. And this is the challenge that we currently have in the UK. How do we shift all of these fossil fuels to a renewable source? Now, the current method at the moment is to look at electrifying it, but in order to generate, I said we need a significant increase in renewables in the grid as well. And that's obviously what the UK government is looking to do with significant investment. But how we as organizations can support that is by actually reducing the amount of energy we need to consume. It makes the challenge of converting this energy into a renewable source easier as well. Now, one of the key things when we're looking at energy itself, particularly for organizations, is also to think about, yes, we want to energy management in terms of making reductions, and that drives through our carbon emissions. But this is also the opportunity when it comes to actually reducing costs for the organization. So whilst decarbonisation is key, as I spoke previously, decarbonisation doesn't necessarily sit hand in hand with cost reduction, whereas energy management does. By reducing the amount of energy we consume, we will inevitably save costs to the organization. Now, we've all been through the sort of climate crisis, the energy crisis that we had over the last couple of years, which is still present in many respects, and still a lot of uncertainty in the future. But essentially, this sort of graph here shows you how your energy bill breaks down in terms of where the different costs come from. Now, the key one here, as we can see in the blue section, is wholesale costs. That's where a lot of the energy price initially sits, and that's what's driven by market. So one of the key things to reducing our energy is we also reduce the reliance we have on grid energy. But from a protection point of view, and one of the things the UK government is trying to do is to increase energy security so that we're relying less on fossil fuels, which are impacted heavily by market factors, and rely more on what we can generate in the UK as well. And so for organizations that are able to, say, introduce on-site renewable generation, it's a great way of protecting yourself and ensuring that you're more secure, and also minimizing costs as well. And here we see the sort of the fluctuation we've experienced pretty much from COVID through to the Ukraine war up until recent, and the changes in the sort of the wholesale prices. And that's really what's been driving energy costs. Now, whilst it has stabilized, we can still see it stabilized higher than it was prior to 2020. The outlook for the energy is still uncertain because of everything going on in the market at the moment. It's hard to necessarily predict what costs are going to do. So when you are looking at understanding in terms of return on investment, it is always worth bearing in mind that energy is volatile in terms of the costs. So actually thinking about things that will help to protect yourself against market shocks is obviously something that should be prioritized whenever making energy decisions. So that leads us on to energy bills. So the first part of a set of energy management is understanding, actually, what is this costing me, and what is my energy bill telling me? So I won't go into too much detail on these slides today. This is what we will cover more in the workshops. But the most important thing is that we are, as organizations, we are actively looking at our bills. And the key thing I want to take away from this is, are you actually looking at actual bills or estimated bills? And you'd be surprised the amount of organizations we work with that when we look at their energy bills, 80% of them are estimated. It's really important to ensure that you are maintaining good control of your finances, that you are ensuring that your supplier is receiving actual meter readings, at least on a monthly or quarterly basis, to ensure that you are being charged appropriately and not being hit by sort of unestimated energy consumption. It's also really important to consider if you have a smart meter or a half-hourly meter, and to see if you're entitled to one as well. So there is a government mandate to roll out smart meters by 2025 for domestic and small businesses. For most large organizations, there is an opportunity to potentially look at half-hourly data, which is actually amazing when it comes to actually looking at energy management. If you have half-hourly data, it's really important that you start to look at that type of detail, because that will really help with the energy management process. So when you're looking at your energy bills, if you're not sure what type of meter you have, all energy bills and all meters have what they call an NPAN, a meter point administration number. And what we're looking for is the profile class, this top section here where it has 01 on the slide. So for smaller businesses, this is likely to be 03 or 04. And what that means is 03 just means you have a standard rate. 04 means you have a variable rate, which means you'll be charged a smaller amount at nighttime than you will be charged in the daytime. And for everybody, nighttime essentially is midnight until 7 in the morning, and you'll be charged a lower rate, which is useful to know when it comes to sort of cost shifting when you're looking at energy management. If your meter is 05 to 08, then you essentially should have a half-hourly meter and are therefore able to access half-hourly data. And if your profile class is 00, you have a half-hourly meter and again are able to access half-hourly data. So if you're not sure and have never actually thought about what kind of information you have available to you, have a look on your energy bill, see what profile class you have. And if you are half-hourly, start to speak to your supplier to obtain that information, because that will give you a whole range of opportunities to actually recognize and identify where energy opportunities sit just within the management itself. Half-hourly also means that you are potentially charged by time of use. And that, again, is really important because there are certain times of the day which are more expensive than others. So again, speaking to your supplier to understand what parts of the day are most expensive, because when it comes to energy management, particularly from a cost perspective, if you can use your most energy, so we say, hungry devices at times when energies are cheaper, whilst it won't necessarily save energy, what it will do is help to minimize costs, which can then be used in terms of investments and actually making changes going forward as well. So really understanding your energy bill, understanding what type of metering you have, and understanding what data you have available to you is really important. And the first thing we get any organization to do is to understand what kind of meter do I have, what kind of data do I have access to, and am I using that data in the best possible way? Okay, so talking about data, what gets measured gets managed effectively. So data is really important because it allows you to set credible targets. It allows you to measure performance, and also it helps to support action development. So, if you put an action in place or behavior in place that you're anticipating to save 5% of your energy, but when you're looking at your data, it's not saving 5%. Well, straight away you understand that something's not working the way intended to be. It could either be that the new piece of equipment, there's an error with it. It might be that there needs to be more training needs behind it, or maybe the communication engagement staff isn't quite where we want it to be. So really, really important that we are measuring our data frequently. And like I say, yeah, it validates efficiency savings from any improved technology or actions that you introduce. Now, when it comes to data, whilst that's useful and we want to be able to look at it and see how we're performing, what really is the sort of the key step when it comes to energy management is understanding how business activity impacts your energy use. So to do this, what we want to do effectively is conduct an energy review. Now, this is something you could do yourselves, or it's something you can actually bring a third party in to do on your behalf. So again, options available to you, and we'll talk a bit about it at the end of today's session. Essentially, what we're looking to do as part of an energy review is to analyze your energy use and consumption, identifying what types of energy you have in use. And we also want to look at past energy consumption as well to see if there's any sort of trends. Are we using more energy in winter than we are in summer, and what's the reasons for that kind of thing. Now, what's really important, and we talk about this as carbon management, is to prioritize. So as part of energy analysis, we want to identify our significant energy uses. So what processes, what equipment, technologies, etc. on site do we have that consume the larger proportion of our energy? And then that's what we want to focus on, the priority. What are the opportunities? How do we improve that? What are the behaviors, etc.? We'll talk a bit about in today's session and certainly in the workshops, but that's really what we want to do as the energy review is why are we using energy? How are we using it? And which of our processes or equipments are using the most of that energy? So we want to think about the variables. We want to understand the current energy performance of those equipments. And we also want to think about what actually is being done. So in fact, what are the behaviors and control systems that sit around that? And like I said, the key thing here is to understand and prioritize which opportunities we want to focus on first. Because if we have a really energy hungry piece of equipment and we find that actually through controls we can reduce that by 10%, that's a significant saving that we can make to our energy consumption on site as well. And obviously, therefore, cost savings as well. So in terms of understanding energy data, I'm not very sure exactly where everybody comes from in terms of their knowledge on this stage. So this slide is just here to sort of cover all bases. The key thing is that depending on how you're measuring your energy, there's certain things just to take into account. So your utility bills will always provide you with the energy data in terms of kilowatt hours. So your electricity bill will be in kilowatt hours, as your gas bill will be in kilowatt hours as well. Essentially, your electricity meter is effectively a reduction of meter to meter. So the difference between each meter reading is exactly the energy you've consumed in kilowatt hours. If you have got a dual meter, which means you have a day and night rate, like I said, the 04 and the standard metering, but you'll see it on your energy bill. You'll see two different rates. It's important to actually look at and capture both the night and day rate because they will have uses for you. We'll talk about more of that in the workshop. When it comes to gas meters, just so you know, your bill will give you your kilowatt hours, but your gas meter is a volume measurement of the gas you're consuming. So it is done in cubic meters, or if you're a very old meter, cubic feet. You'll see that on the meter itself. Just bear in mind that if you are shifting from utility bills to meter readings in terms of how you're capturing your data, just bear in mind that you're now shifting from an energy consumption to a volume consumption, and you'll either need to convert or just change entirely. And that's really important when we come to sort of carbon accounting. What kind of data do we have when we're converting into carbon, and just making sure that we're putting in the right sort of information. If any of us use oil, whether that's LPG, oil in a tank for, if you're off grid in terms of you're not using natural gas, etc., that's typically bought in liters. And again, that's whenever you buy whenever you get your tank gets up filled, essentially you'll then be given a bill in terms of how many meters you've consumed. If you want to improve understanding of oil, then one of the things to consider is actually putting in a flow rate meter to your oil tank which means you'll then be able to actually measure exactly when and how you're using oil, kind of similar to the gas meter, rather than just having these big sort of deliveries and periodics throughout. You could be 2 years, two deliveries 1 year, three the next, and it doesn't really give you much to go off, just when the oil got delivered, as opposed to when and how you're actually using it. So something to consider if you use a significant amount of oil and wish to improve the measurements and the monitoring of that. Okay, so when we're looking at data, same as with carbon management, the key thing we want to do is set our baseline. So here we want to think about what is our baseline, our reference year from any management that goes forwards in terms of actually how we're going to track our performance over time. So similar to carbon measurement, annually we might change year to year in terms of business activity, but what we want to see is a general trend over time. So what I would typically say is whatever baseline you're setting for your carbon management, I've set the same baseline for your energy as well. And like I said, what we want to do is we do want to look at ourselves on an annual basis in terms of how we're performing, but we also want to think about the 5-year objectives that we talk about as part of net zero planning. So what is our energy management going to look like over 5 years? And actually, what are we going to do year on year to get to that point? So we can see a general trend, allowing for the shocks of business activities, which might go up and down depending on the year itself. In terms of where to start, the most important thing is the data needs to be meaningful. Like I said, the more accurate the information is, the more informed you can be when making decisions. And that's why it's important that if you're looking at utility bills, that you have got actual data, not estimated data, because it makes more, it's more relevance to yourself. But really, it's just down to what kind of fuels are we using. So electricity and gas you can get from your meters, or you can get from your energy bills. Oil will be from bills. If you're looking at transport, again, that could be mileage claims through expenses, or it could be actually liters purchased if you have a fuel card. So it's thinking about all the different types of energy you have, and where is that information, who's best to gather that information, and then ultimately who's best to record that. What's really important is gathering the information is vital. What we then want to do is to be able to record that. Typically, Excel sheets is a great way to sort of do it. But most importantly, we want to be able to record it in such a way that we can look at performance over time. So we need to be able to have comparison functions within it. Now, I'm a key believer that data is great and it's fantastic. However, numbers generally don't mean anything to anyone. So what we want to do with that information is convert it into a visual format that you can now assess and look at. Because within these sort of graphs, we can look at trends, we can look at where there's maybe higher use than lower use. And we want to do this over a period of time. So we want to be able to look at maybe 3 years and consecutive from each other and say, well, actually, what's the data telling us? Do we see any particular trends? Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this element in this session today, just because of time. But certainly as part of the workshop, one thing that we will do is work through examples around different energy profiles, what kind of things we would look to consider. But just very quickly, the left-hand side here is a totally electricity, which means it has a gas heating system. The right-hand graph here is actually electrically heated. So you can see that sort of bell curve from high energy use in the winter to low energy use in the summer. Now, when you're looking at sort of generation, it's important to think about what kind of generation do we want to put in, and does it match our usage patterns? So for example, if you're investing in solar, solar's the transverse to this. High solar generation in the summer, very low generation in the winter. So it doesn't quite match the heating profile that we have here. So it's thinking about what kind of system we want to put in place, and also just understanding the limitations that different systems will have based on our energy needs. On the left-hand example here, we can see high use in winter. So what's driving that? Given that we're gas heated, what could be the reasons why we have gas? So what this will do is just sort of identify where there might be parts to look at, and then see what kind of behaviors exist on site that's driving these increases on these particular months. So we want to be able to gather the data, put it in a useful way, and then convert it into a way that we can quickly look at it and start to assess where there might be problems or which months you want to investigate further as well. Now, as I mentioned, if you have access to half-hourly data or have access to more, so we say intermittent data, this is the type of information you can produce from it. So here we're actually able to look at a far more granular level, actually how our energy is used. So the graph before was monthly, so we can see general trends month to month, but that doesn't necessarily tell us when and where we're using our energy. This is what half-hourly data will do for us. So here in half-hourly data, we can start to see actually where energy's peaking, how it's managing, and where there's general trends. So very quickly in this graph, we can see first thing in the morning between midnight and 4 o'clock, there's lots of spikes in our energy when this company isn't even in operation. So straight away, there's an opportunity there. What's going on? How's that happening? Do we have timers in place? What does a shutdown look like? Why are systems switching on at that time? Because if you can drop all of that, that's a significant amount of energy you can save during the year. We can see a peak at 5 o'clock on essentially it doesn't have all the graph on you, which will be the Sunday. So why on a Sunday is there a peak at 5:30 in the morning? And this is the average over the entire year. So that's something that's happening quite frequently. So once you have half-hourly data, you can break into how and why energy is being used across the site in a far better way than just a monthly meter read. So if you have opportunity to improving the way in which you can measure and track your data, or you have access to half-hourly data, it's really important that you start to download that, start to use that. And I say we'll go through some more detail in the workshop around how to actually turn this data into something that you can use more easily in terms of making decisions where, or identifying where there might be opportunities to investigate further. Now, alongside any energy management, we also have to understand that business activity will affect the way we use our energy. For lots of organizations, our key aim is to grow. We want to grow, we want to take up more clients, we want to expand, we want to do more things. So, the problem with energy management is that, yes, we want to reduce the amount of energy, but that sometimes sits sort of counter to the fact that we want to grow as organizations. So as part of that understanding our energy use, the key thing we want to recognize is what business activity drives in terms of energy use, and what that activity is, how can we use that to benchmark our performance. So, for example, if we are using electricity, say we're producing a product and we're manufacturing in that way, and so for every ton of product we produce, we expect there to be energy that will sit closely to that, and that's our biggest drive to energy. So we could then measure our performance against production volumes. So whilst we might have a reduction target, if we've grown in terms of the amount of output we're producing, but we can compare that to our production volumes, we can actually show that yes, we've grown, but actually our energy per ton product is about the same, or actually come down slightly. So like I said, it's a great way of investigating into how business activity is impacting your energy. And so there's a whole range of different things you can do. Not all energy sources will have the same business activity, so it is worthwhile understanding what is driving the use of that energy, and how can I compare that to that activity to show meaningful data in terms of our performance. One key one is gas, for example. If you're using gas for heating, heating is directly linked to the outside weather. So actually, if it's colder outside, you will use more gas, regardless of how efficient your system is. So things like degree days is another way of doing it. And I say we'll talk more about that within the workshops themselves, and actually go through benchmarking and how to use it and what kind of things to consider as well. But yeah, always important thinking that yes, absolute reductions are key. However, it's not always possible in certainly a growing market, whereas as an organization, you're looking to expand and grow. Now, one thing that we do always talk to organizations about is thinking things like sub-meters. I get asked the question, should we look at sub-meters? What kind of information can we get from it? This, I'll always say, will come down to the type of organization and how you're using your energy. Key thing for sub-meters. So for example, if you have got very different operations on site, so say you've got a manufacturing or production process and you've got an office process, but you have 1 meter for the entire site, those two processes are very different in terms of how they use energy. So actually sub-metering your office against sub-metering your production end is actually something that's worth considering, because then you can start to look at how your office function is managed and actually apply specific actions to that function. And you can also look at your production and start to apply specific actions whilst being able to measure the changes that are made in each of those areas. I don't always recommend sub-meters everywhere. It really comes down to what it is that you're looking to do. You don't have to permanently put in sub-meters. You can effectively what they call is collaring. So you can maybe isolate a particular process. It might be a particular piece of machine that you want to upgrade or change for a new one, and you want to understand how the energy is consumed. So for example, anybody who uses compressors, you can get your compressor company to come out and do this type of survey. They'll collar your compressor, they'll actually monitor its usage over 2 weeks, and then from that they'll be able to recommend improvements that you can make either to the system, whether it's upgrading to a variable speed drive or whatever it looks like. They can help to identify it. So it's really important that if you have got, shall we say, multiple energy uses, that sub-metering is something that you could consider. But as I said, there's always a cost to it. So you always want to make sure what it is that you're trying to iron out or isolate out, and what is that going to mean for you going forward in terms of any opportunity that you identify. Now, as I mentioned, the Carbon Trust, they do have a guide in terms of the right type of sub-metering or additional type of shall we say, energy management controls that you might want. And these are sort of recommended of the type of maybe meters or controls or systems you might want to think about implementing to support your energy management, again, depending on the type of organization you are and also the size you are as well in terms of your energy consumption. Okay, so we spoke about energy. As I said, the key thing is that we want to start to gather the data, understand what it means, start to think about our organization, and start to think about an energy review. Now, in terms of reviewing ourselves as an organization, there's a general approach to any auditing. Now, essentially, myself as an auditor, or Tony, who's the Lincolnshire support for Business Lincolnshire, this is essentially the approach that we take. So here within this, what we're looking to do is, first of all, understand what's the purpose? What are we actually trying to achieve? What do you want us to look at? Now, an audit can be as broad as you want or as specific as you want. So it might be that you just want to know what your heating system's doing, so you can come in and do an audit on your heating system. It might be that you want to understand all energy use across the organization, so you do a full broad energy audit. So identifying the purpose. So you want to understand something in your organization. What is it? And then what information do you need, and what information is available? So also then, who wants to be involved in that? So basically, who's got knowledge of the process? So if there's someone on site who uses that piece of equipment, then they need to be involved in that audit. Now, they don't necessarily need to do the audit, but they need to be available to ask questions, to be, how does this work? How do you do? What are your behaviors? How does it shut down? All that kind of stuff. So the person doing the auditing is really important that they have access to anybody and everybody who can help them understand what's going on site, relevant to the purpose of the audit. So then we want to connect and analyze the relevant data. So again, that's what we talk about. What kind of data sets do we have? What kind of information is available to us? So here we're looking at historical energy data, maybe information on the systems themselves. Do we have the maintenance records? So if we're looking at heating, when was the boiler last serviced? Was there anything on the boiler service note that told us there were maybe problems with the boiler? Does it have the efficiency information in it? So here we just want to see what data we have available to us and then start to look at that. So collecting the data, yes, but then also analyzing it, going over it, seeing where there might be trends, or actually does this say that the boiler is not as efficient as it could be, so etc. So what the purpose, who needs to be involved in it, and then what data do we need to collect to be able to start and recognize where there's opportunities. The next step then is to conduct the audit. So basically just walk around and have a look at the different processes and controls, and we'll go a little bit detailed today in session, but we'll cover this more in the workshops. But yeah, what we're essentially doing is we're looking at all the different process, the equipment, the behaviors, what's happening on site, how does it work, etc. And we're starting to gather that information and essentially record what's happening on site. Once we've done that audit, we then want to consider what did we recognize, what identified opportunities were there, and then when we're looking at our recommendations, thinking about, well, actually, how much is it going to cost us to do it versus what are we actually going to save from doing it. Now, we might need to think about lifetime costs, maintenance costs, effects on staff time, etc. A new piece of equipment, whilst could be more energy efficient, might mean more trainings. We do need to balance that out when we're talking about it. But also, we also need to think about our future objectives. So what, are we going to be net zero? In which case, actually, that small increase of staff time benefits us in the longer term if we're talking 10, 15 years on our route to achieving net zero. And then you want to build an action plan. So whatever you recognize, you put your recommendations together, and then together with your senior management team or whoever basically involved in making decisions, sits down and goes, okay, what can we do straight away? What do we need to fit into larger objectives, and what do we need to do in the future? And then build your action plan. And that can fit into your carbon reduction plan in terms of, these are the actions we've put forward to reducing our energy, and this is how it's going to benefit us from our carbon reduction plans going forward. So like I said, this is something you can do yourself, but there are third-party sources that can come in and do the support, do this for you and be able to provide you with the sort of action plan. But by understanding what the process is and by doing it yourself, it means that should you get a third party in, it's hopefully a little bit more understanding in terms of what it is they're doing, the information they're providing you, and how best to use it. So whenever we're looking at auditing, the general thing within all of this is we just need to consider the key questions. So here, what we want to do is to understand basically what is going on, why is it doing that, how does it do it, and is there an opportunity to make it better? So first and foremost, you want to think about what are the processes or what equipment is being used to achieve that function. So that could be the heating. The process is heating. Okay, well, what equipment are we using to heating? The boiler, the radiators, could be air conditioning systems, etc. The process could be lighting. So how are we lighting? What kind of equipment do we have? Do we have sensors, etc.? So thinking about all the different needs of energy across the organization and thinking about the different pieces of equipment that effectively achieve that function, then we want to think about, as part of all of that, does occupation or business activity affect this operation? So for example, lighting, obviously if we're in the building, we want it lit, but if we're not in the room, Does that light still need to be on? How is that being controlled? Is there a behavior? Does it have a sensor? Is there an opportunity to improve that? So by walking around some sites, I look into rooms and see the lights have been left on. And again, businesses, if you're not actively looking at this or thinking about this, a really quick win would just be engaging with the staff to make sure we have a good switch off procedure. So every time we leave the room, lights are being turned off, and that's something that we are continually engaging our staff with. Again, so what are the behaviors? So what are the manual behaviors? What do the employee understand? Do they understand how things need to behave? Do they understand switch on and switch off, particularly when we're talking, for heating? Do they understand the sort of the thermostats and how they need to be controlled? Are they leaving the thermostats alone and allowing someone else to do it? Are there automated controls? Is there a timer to this? Is there a sensor attached to it? Are they working as they should be, or can these be improved? We then want to think about, so here we're talking about optimization. The next thing we want to talk about is then asset replacement. So what's the age and efficiency of this? Is it 15, 20 years old? Could it be replaced? Is the efficiency from, the service note showing that the efficiency is reducing? So is that something we need to consider? And then, like I said, when we've identified the opportunity, what are the final financial implications of doing this? What's it going to cost us? What is our saving? And what does that mean for return on investment? And how does that fit into our overall objectives? And one key thing to always take away is, what does your shutdown look like? How are things being switched off? Who's responsible for managing that? How are the lights being turned off? How is the heating system switching off? When does that happen, etc.? So when you're conducting your audits, or when you're going around sites, what we want to think about is making sure that you've documented everything. So obviously, whether you do that on a tablet or pen and paper, but just basically we want to document everything, taking photos of key areas. So actually, as you're going around taking photos, really useful to be able to refer back to something that you saw rather than having to go back out to the place and look at it again. And then also, like I said, depending on what type of audit you want or what kind of information you want to look at, there are some additional technologies that might be useful to you. Now, you can either rent these or buy these, depending on how often you're likely to do these types of audits. Or again, it's worth speaking to a third party to say, look, we want to understand our heater. Do you have an infrared camera? Can you come and do a heating review for us? So again, understanding what is available could be useful as well. So three key things that we generally would look at most organizations as standard would be a lux meter or a light meter. So if you're looking to improve your lighting from fluorescent to LEDs, then actually understanding the amount of light each space needs and how many LEDs you need in space is pivotal. So if you're choosing a lighting provider to do this for you, insist they do a lux review as well to understand the lighting needs. If you're doing heating, infrared cameras or laser thermometers are great at looking at building fabric, looking at insulation. Is there any gaps in insulation? Can we see heat loss? Is your boiler plant insulated well? So again, really good to look at in terms of how heat is being moved across the site. And if you are looking at sort of complex energy systems, compressors, it might be CNC machines, a larger piece of equipment that you're looking to replace, then multi-clamp meters, as I mentioned, would be a great way of actually understanding how that piece of equipment is being used, and then applying that to a new piece of equipment and where there might be opportunities to improve upon that. Now, as I mentioned before, what we really want to look at when we are sort of assessing this is optimization and efficiencies first, because obviously we're looking at behaviors and controls. Can we make this equipment as efficient as we possibly can? That's a great way of saving energy without actually having to spend a lot of money. And you can save up to 40%. The average is around about 10 to 40%. Normally we look at about 15 to 20% savings for most organizations, obviously depending on where you are. Asset replacement is second. So we have an optimized system, we might need to look about replacing. And what's key here is that whilst we want optimization first, sometimes optimizing a really inefficient system versus replacing the system, sometimes it's a no-brainer just to replace it because that will give us the best savings. So we might need to occasionally consider replacing something that's really old and really inefficient rather than spending our time trying to optimize it. However, once it's replaced, we need to make sure the behaviors and trainings in place that it's operated in the most efficient way. And then the final thing to think about is then energy generation. And again, we always talk about this as being the end. That's what you want to do. But sometimes there might be need to think about generation at a time when, for example, you might be able to put solar PV on and there's not really much opportunity to optimize or actually replace any assets. So energy generation is the next step to be able to make the changes and reductions that you need. So it's always worth thinking this is the priority order, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way it will end up. So I did talk about this last week, but just to go over it again. So in terms of controls, these are the type of things that you want to look at. As I said, this webinar is recorded. So if you want to spend a bit more time in these, you'll be able to access on the recording. But again, what is the control doing? How does it operate? Who's managing that control? when the piece of equipment is running, what's that control meant to do? And again, always, is it actually doing what we anticipate it should be doing? And how easy is it to change it? Is it actually a place that we can simply swap out the control? Is there a better control that could be introduced to actually make our management easier? Or is it maybe the behaviors around how the controls are used? So these are sort of questions to think about when you're looking at your systems and how they're actually being used on site. One thing I always talked about in terms of shutdown procedures, so vampire loads, refers to in many ways, but vampire loads is one I've always liked. Essentially, we're using energy outside of operational hours. So you're not actually doing anything, yet you're still consuming energy. So you're spending money at a time when you're not actually producing money. So this is why shutdowns are really important. Who's shutting down? Are the right switches being turned off? Are there any timers and are they set correctly? Again, when we do half-hourly reviews, the amount of times we've seen on a half-hourly review, like the example I showed you, we had that sort of morning sort of peaks. That's clearly a timer problem or something within the system that isn't operating correctly. So what does that shutdown look like? And are the systems behaving the way that we anticipate they should be? And then again, if there's places that are hard to actually access in terms of accessing plugs, you can get 7-day timers, which you can basically plug your equipment into it, and actually you could set a timing program to it. The key thing with timers for me is always, just because you set a timer, it does need to be periodically checked to make sure it matches, especially when it comes to daylight savings. Does your timer match the daylight savings? Again, something we have seen quite a few times with businesses where they put the timer and forgot about it and then couldn't work out why things weren't quite matching their business because they hadn't taken into account the change we have twice a year. So again, just thinking of some questions to go around. I won't spend too much time. Heating is probably the biggest one for most organizations. It's certainly an area that for lots of businesses that we work with, this is the one that I guess proves the most headache for them because it's one that's so necessary but uses a lot of energy. Simply, really, again, these are just sort of basic questions to ask when you're looking at your heating system. So actually, what are the needs for our site? So why are we heating the site? What heating needs do we have? Do all of our rooms, are they heated according to the room's use? So sometimes we can just set our heating to 21 degrees and then you go into rooms that just never get occupied or use the storerooms. If they're being heated, turn the heating off, just again, to optimize the system better. So thinking about how heat is applied across the site. You also want to think about, so as I said, what are the needs for heating? What are the needs for cooling? Cooling particularly is if, for example, you have south-facing large glazing and that room gets really hot in the summer, look at shading, look at window films. How can I actually prevent the heat coming through the windows? So it means I don't have to put the AC on to, 19, 20 degrees and can actually leave it at a more reasonable temperature without everybody cooking inside the room itself. And then again, what kind of systems do you have and how do they work? So how is your boiler system working? How does it feed the radiators? What does the temperature control look like? Is it doing what it's supposed to be doing? Are we happy that the system is providing the heat that we want to do? Do we have cold areas in our site? So particularly if you've got older buildings, you can find the heating in most rooms are fine, but then you always have that one part of the building that just always seems to be cold. So what's happening in there? Is there anything that we can do to those spaces to improve the heating without affecting the rest of the site? What does the control system look like? Is it temperature controlled? Is there a single thermostat? Do you have zonal controlling? That kind of thing. If you have got both heating and cooling, do those systems actually work in tandem with each other? Do they fight against each other? Do you have a deadband setting? These sort of things. So thinking about the needs of the organization, the systems that you have, and are the systems doing what they should be doing? And also, how are they being controlled? Also, with that, can your employees access those controls? Are they turning thermostats up? Again, something we see time and time again. We speak to the person, they say, oh no, we got a 21-degree set. You go into a room and it's like walking into the palm, into some tropical country where they've turned the thermostat up to 24 degrees because they felt a bit cold, or they wanted to heat the room up quicker. Again, another behavioral thing. Also to think about, does your system match your needs? So has your building changed since your plant was installed? Again, something we see time and time again. The building was set up for X reason. You've now moved in, changed the entire process that happens on that site. And actually, the heating needs are not the same as they were when they first set up. So you might have a larger boiler than you need. The AC plant might not be the right size for the rooms. You might even split rooms up, which means that part of the room isn't being heated or cooled the same way the other part was because it wasn't designed that way. So always thinking about changes to the site and how the energy systems are matching the use of the site. And that also needs to consider occupancy. So what time do we need to heat from until? How quick does it take to heat our building up? How late can we wait until we turn our heating system on to minimize the amount of time that it's running? These sort of things. In terms of temperature settings, this is a guide, comes from CIPSE. So this is the Chartered Institute for Building Services and Engineering. Essentially, they put together this guide as a sort of, these are the most efficient settings based upon the type of areas that you have. Key thing here is sedentary type lifestyles want sort of 21 degrees. So that's anybody sat in an office. More active work, you probably don't need it anywhere near as high as that. So, as you can see here, heavy work is down as almost like 12 to 14. Sort of light work is around 16 to 18. So also thinking about, like I said, what is the need for heat, and is our heating system matching that, or is it just sort of plug and play and the heating just does what it does? Another thing I also recommend for some organizations is to think about actually measuring the temperatures in rooms. So do you have thermometers, whether you have thermostats or not, but can you actually measure how hot a room is using a thermometer? Because again, if staff then complain it's too cold, you can look and say, well, actually it's 21 degrees, it's fine. Maybe there's something else we can do, move them away from a window, or look at any sort of other problems there might be within the room that can help them stay comfortable without having to increase the heating for the site. Again, building fabric, really important. However, I also appreciate probably the most difficult for lots of businesses, particularly where you don't own the building. But it is really important to actually look at your building fabric. Most importantly, I look at windows and doors, particularly looking at how airtight they are, because drafts are an absolute nightmare for any sort of convection heating. So if anyone's sat near a window and they're especially cold, are the seals correct? Are the windows correct? Can you actually feel wind coming through it? Could that be improved? Doors particularly, are the seals still intact on doors, or can you see big air like light between the two doors being closed? Also thinking about access to the site. So do you have spaces where doors are open continually, like delivery areas, reception areas? And are those doors being continually opened? And how is that impacting the way heat is being in those areas? So we did a bit of work with a sort of large company that had a huge sort of foyer where obviously people could come in and out. And the receptionist was basically sat next to the door. And because so many people coming in and out of the building, essentially that door was open continuously, and she was freezing, and they had the aircon up to 24 degrees, the highest they could set it, and it just basically meant all the heating was going out the door. So when we're looking at building fabric, it's also looking at how the building is being used, and also access is a key thing to think about. And actually, is there a better way to heat spaces that have that high level of volume where doors are being opened continuously, rather than trying to throw like a heating system which is basically go out the door? Lighting is the next one. So obviously here we want to think about, again, like everything else, what's the need? What kind of lighting does the building receive? Do you have good levels of natural light? Are you using those levels of natural light, or do lights just get switched on because that's the behavior that we have at the moment? What kind of controls do you have? And also the other thing is, if you have got light switches, especially if you've got banks of light switches, are they clearly labeled as to what they turn on? And I've been to places where all the lights get turned on because no one could actually want to work out which switch did what. So they just switched it all on and went off and did the things that they were supposed to be doing. So also thinking about how light switches are labeled, and again, the behaviors, and helping your staff and employees to understand the best way to manage lighting is a great way of understanding ways to improve sort of lighting behaviors. But where you've got corridors, where you've got natural light, there are sensors you can look at putting in place that will help to sort of, allow people to use those spaces, and the lights on, and when they leave, the lights will turn off automatically. So is there a need for sensoring? Where's the best place to put them? That kind of thing. And then finally, when it comes to generation, key thing is, the type of generation you need will depend on the business itself. Now, most common is solar PV. We talked about this in last session. So if you want a bit more information around solar PV, have a look at last week's recording. But really what we're looking for here is, from an auditing perspective, is what is the type of generation we need that will benefit us. So obviously we want to prioritize efficiency, as we've spoken about it. But like I said, that's not always possible. Sometimes generation can be the first thing to think about. And we need to think about what that generation means. Do we need electricity? Do we need heat? Do we need both? Is there a practical solution that can give us what our generation needs are? And how do we sort of tie that into it? When we're looking at generation, things to consider is occupancy hours. Does the need for energy match the generation system? So as I said in the example, if I'm putting solar PV in, which is effectively a summertime system, but my energy need is heating in the winter, they're not going to match quite the same way that we wanted it to. So how do we sort of negate that? What other systems might be better for us to consider? What's always possible is, actually, can you generate on site? So if the system is larger than 4 kilowatts, so solar PV system 10, 15, 20 kilowatts, you have to get permission from the district network operator. they may limit the system. So it's always worth checking if you are going to put generation in place, can I actually get this in place? And then if you are going to put generation in, how's that going to integrate into your existing system, and how closely located is the generation plant from the need? So, for example, if I'm generating heat on a site and that's 100 meters away from where I need the heat, I've just lost all that energy and all that sort of benefit from that because of the transportation of that heat and the efficiency losses I'll achieve by doing it. And again, as an example, solar PV puts on a warehouse roof because that's where there's lots of space, but actually where we need the energy in a production site could be 300-400 meters away. So it's really important to understand that, yes, we need generation, but how is that generation actually going to essentially sits within our site, and how is that going to best integrate with the systems we have so that we get it in the right place and maximize the benefit that we get from the generation itself. Okay, so when it comes to recommendations, so here we are talking about, so we've done our review, we've gone around, we looked at all the different things, and we've basically pulled out where there's opportunities, but what we want to do is prioritize those. So when we're looking at recommendations, and again, this is what you'd expect from a third party person, is ideally to try and stick to facts, limit assumptions to only where they're required. Now, assumptions is always going to be frequency of use, how often a site is used. If I've never been to that site before, I have to make an assumption based on what I see, not necessarily knowing exactly how a room is used. So always be aware of that. I also need to consider what was decided and agreed upon from the audits. I said about understanding the purpose of the audits. What kind of activities are we looking to introduce? So whenever we're making recommendations, the first one we always want to go for is the quick wins. What can be done straight away? So that could be metering or monitoring improvements. Do we need sub-metering? Should we improve our data collection? That kind of thing. So they should be the other way around. Equipment optimization, how can we make it more efficient? And then equipment replacement, actually does this just need replacing, and what is there a better solution for us? Is there potentially innovation on the horizon? Might it be actually we do want a particular piece of equipment that's fairly innovative, maybe we want to wait a bit of while just to see a test bed first before we start to introduce it? Or do we want to be pioneers and invest in new innovation? So is there something that's relevant to us within our sector that can help us? And then we want to look at on-site generation. Now, these are, again, like I say, priorities, but doesn't mean that we have to go in this order. It's what's right for your business. And then just very quickly in terms of actions to consider, again, these are some of the most common recommendations or actions that we recommend for organizations to look at. So LED lighting, sensors, behaviors, things like travel needs, vehicle trackers if you have fleet, thinking about your heating needs, the timers, the thermostats, the different types of controls that go within your heating, the age of plants, etc. Things like infrared, it talks about that reception. That was the best recommendation for them, putting infrared over the receptionist, so you're not trying to heat the entire space, just the person. What is your hot water needs? How are you heating your water? What does that system look like? And then also when you talk about renewable, you've got solar, wind, heat pumps, battery storage, etc. Sorry, I'm just conscious of time. I'll sort of whiz through these last ones. We'll pick these up in more detail in part of the workshops. But one of the key things is when we're talking about energy, really what we want to do as an organization is what is our commitment to actually managing this energy and thinking about the policy that sits behind that. So do we have an energy policy that's actually demonstrating our commitment to this and is essentially now our policy for our staff to be aware of in terms of how we want to manage energy going forward? So like any policy, we want to have our commitments, which is our statement of intent. So obviously we want to use less energy, but within that, then what are our objectives to do that? How is that going to work? What is outcomes going to look like? And what kind of information do we have? And that needs to be accessible to all, really. So here, what we want is a policy that essentially says, this is how we're going to manage our energy, and this is what all of our staff and anybody on site needs to adhere to as part of our energy policy. So very similar to anybody who has an environmental policy. However, this one's pulled out just specifically to look at energy and how that needs to be used on site. Like any energy policy, it needs to have commitment from senior level. It needs to obviously understand the context of the organization. What is the energy needs for the site? How are they being used? What the scope of the policy is. So exactly what we're going to cover in this instance, scope 1 and 2. And then obviously, what are the objectives? So how are we going to focus on reducing energy? What kind of things are we going to be putting in place? What kind of behaviors do we expect, etc.? And then how are we going to essentially monitor that progress? So targets, etc. Now, all of this can't be done without the engagement of staff, and it's really important that staff are brought along on this. What we don't want to do is just make changes and then tell staff it's been changed. We want to engage them, say, look, these are the changes we want to introduce. How do you think it would work? Would that work for you? What kind of things are you doing, and what kind of contribution can you make to these particular actions and changes? Bringing people along is a far better way than just making changes and expecting people to do it. Now, this will come down to the type of organization in terms of your size. Key thing here is if you have the ability to create an energy team and also have a green champion team, then that's something to consider. For smaller organizations, it would just be the green champion element. So larger ones, we have maybe more complex energy needs and a larger sort of, shall we say, employee base. You might want to think about an energy team. And here you're looking at key responsible individuals to look at different things. So this needs to include senior leadership, maybe any facility managers or operators, so people who actually manage the site and manage the energy use, and then senior representatives across different departments of the organization. For smaller organizations and also for larger ones, just to get staff engagements, you want to think about surveys, identifying enthusiastic or willing staff, so anybody who's willing to sort of help towards, managing energy or even just the sustainability objectives, and then thinking about who's actually got the right responsibility. So who's best for collecting data, who's best for gathering data, who's best for maybe engaging with the team to encourage them to switch lights off, that kind of thing. So it's far easier to have a team approach than doing this individually. And if you can do, these are sort of the type of structures that we would recommend you consider in terms of engaging. And one of the things we also recommend is that as part of the walk around, actually getting staff to do it. It might be a great way of sort of opening up their eyes to how energy is being used across the site. And, it might give them a sort of a bit more responsibility in terms of the sort of the work that they're doing, particularly if it's, looking at a particular process in which they're engaged in. And then finally, knowledge is king. If there's an opportunity to improve, particularly those who are going to be managing your energy, making sure that they have the correct skills and training. Also, particularly on the carbon element, thinking about carbon literacy training, which can be for all your members of staff. So, that sort of knowledge piece is really important to encourage and help to all of your team effectively to have the knowledge to be able to drive through any sort of energy ambitions that you have, which ties into your overall carbon ambitions as well.